Welcome to Embedded. I'm Elecia White. I'm here with Christopher White. This week we had planned to talk amongst ourselves, generally about listener questions, as I've been a poor correspondent lately. However, I kept adding questions about Christopher's latest hobby project, and then wondered if his partner in crime and brother, Matthew White, would like to contribute. And here we are. It's going to be a show about the software Chris wrote when he was 6 and the hardware he wrote it on.
Probably mostly about the software Matthew wrote when I was 6. Hi, Matthew.
Hello.
Now, before we get properly started, I do want to answer one listener question. This one's from Jason. I'm going to read it out. Hi, guys. Been listening to your show since May, and it's always great. Okay, this is me. I love that. Thank you, Jason. You're very good about explaining concepts that are new to some people. I'm starting my first post-college job as a software engineer doing embedded work. Are there any books for embedded that are must-haves? For instance, object-oriented programmers always have a copy of Design Patterns by GOF. Are there equally important books for embedded software design? Your podcast is great. How should we answer him?
You can just plug your own book. I think that's totally appropriate.
Okay, so Jason, I wrote a book. Shockingly, it's called Making Embedded Systems, which is what this podcast used to be called. I guess it was more on the nose then. And Design Patterns for Great Software is the subtitle. So I think the whole Design Patterns is part of it. And it's for hardware engineers looking to write software that's more reusable, that's better. And for software engineers looking to write things closer to the hardware, exactly what you're doing. And so I think, that you should buy my book, maybe. If you like the podcast and how I explain things. Yeah. Okay. Matthew.
Yeah.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello.
It's good to talk to you. Thank you for
Likewise.
being on the show.
My pleasure.
Other than knowing Chris for all of his life, could you tell us about yourself?
I teach math during the day, and I play guitar in clubs and bars at night. That's pretty much my life.
Pretty standard.
Yeah, truly.
You are a professor of mathematics at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So it's teaching some math.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's most of our teaching load is calculus, but in a typical quarter, I'll have 2 calculus classes to teach, and then 1 upper division or graduate course. It's 3 classes a day, 4 days a week, which is a heavy teaching load for a university, but I don't think it's that bad. And that's kind of the job.
And at night you play guitar. How many nights a week do you play guitar?
Well, with the band I'm playing with right now, a band called Rumble, it's anywhere from 3 to 5 nights a week. I mean, it's been kind of crazy. And, for the last 2 weeks, I've kind of had a miniature vacation from it, which maybe later I'll tell you about because it kind of drove me crazy to have a vacation. But, coming up, in a week or two, I just go back to this killer schedule of, playing guitar till 2 a.m. and then getting up early and going in and teaching math almost as early. So it's a lot of nights a week, but it's good.
And you were the guitarist and frontman and sometimes singer of Ballistic Cats.
Yeah, that's right. That was our original roots rock and roll, old school Link Ray style band that we had. And actually, we're plugging things, Ballistic Cats has a gig on August 20th. So if you're in San Luis Obispo, we're up at the Poorhouse. Come see us. That was more of an art band. The band I'm in now is a cover band. So the disadvantage to a cover band is you play cover songs, but the advantage is you get to play all the time because that's what people want. But yeah.
Okay. All that aside, we're going to do lightning round where we ask you short questions and hope you give us short answers. And sometimes if we are behaving properly, we won't ask you for why or how or more information.
Very good.
Christopher?
Rebels or Empire?
Empire.
Favorite physical constant?
E.
Beer or wine?
Beer.
Oh, that's easy. Science, technology, engineering, or math?
Math.
Favorite fictional computer?
The one that was on Wonder Woman in the 70s.
Oh my
I
God.
can't remember its name, but it looked like this toy we had where you could put these little plastic lights of different colors in and make patterns on them. It was basically just a box with lights on it. That was
Light-Bright. Yeah.
Light-Bright, thank you. Yeah, it looked like a Light-Bright. In fact, I think I kind of made a fake version of it out of the Light-Bright that we had. Yeah, that's my favorite computer. Yeah.
Country or Western?
Western.
What do you listen to on your commute?
I don't. In fact, if you play music live a whole lot, I kind of enjoy just utter silence in the car. So I don't listen much at all when I drive.
Least favorite planet?
Most favorite?
Least favorite.
Least favorite is Mercury.
Yeah, that right on the top.
Clearly, we know what Matthew thinks about when he's in the silence of his car.
Beach or mountains?
Beach.
Favorite guitar or pedal?
Both. I'm going to ask him both.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So
you're
favorite
asking me
guitar
both?
and favorite pedal.
Yeah.
My favorite pedal is an MXR Clean Boost of all things, which is kind of inside baseball. Favorite guitar is a lot harder because it just depends on when you ask me that. As of today, right now, it's my Gresh Nashville 6120-1960 again because it saved my life at a wedding last week. But ask me again in a week and I'll have some other opinion.
It saved his life because there was a flash flood and it was big enough that he could row it to
Yeah,
safety.
and actually, if you use the Bigsby the right way, it kind of works like a paddle wheel.
What kind of a mic are you using?
Right now,
Yeah.
KSM 32, sure.
All right. Well, let's get to the point of this show.
Wait, has that ever happened before?
A couple of weeks ago, Matthew, you brought Christopher something because, your garage needed to go into our living room. What did you bring him?
I brought him our old Apple II Plus that my dad bought us, 35 years ago or whatever it was, along with a whole bunch of our old 5 1/4 inch discs of programs that we had written back in early 80s.
Sometimes the late 70s.
Yeah, I guess that's probably true. It's hard for me to remember that far back, but yeah.
And Chris, what did you do with said Apple II Plus?
Well, the goal was to recover some of that stuff because it's kind of a bizarre little time capsule of what we were doing when we were kids. And so I spent a lot of time trying to get it working and then even more time trying to get the data off the old disks and look at some of those very old programs that both of us had written, which is a very strange experience. It's, everybody digs up old pictures they drew as a kid or something, but
The story I wrote in middle school about something.
Somehow computer programs, I don't know, maybe it's because we all continue to use computers our whole lives. Seeing the earliest examples of us interacting with them is really a strange experience. So it had a lot of problems. It had a bad RAM, which took some time to figure out.
How did you determine the RAM was bad?
Well, it kept having errors when I was downloading. So back up a little bit. So old computers don't have a lot of interface ports like modern computers. They don't have serial ports. They don't have parallel ports necessarily. They don't have just about anything except floppy drives. And floppy drives are very old, so they may not be working right. So I found some software called ADT Pro, which is Apple Data Transfer Pro, I think. It's a program somebody put together. And basically, its job is to download a little bootstrap program so you can transfer data off and on. And it'll do it through various ways. And the only way I had available was through the cassette port. And old computers of this vintage used to have little audio output ports that went to a tape deck, a cassette tape deck, and you would save and load programs off the cassette tapes, which almost never worked on the actual computers, if anybody remembers.
There are people out there going, what is a cassette tape?
Yeah, well, that's, you Google it. So yeah, this program would actually take the output of a Mac, the audio output, into the tape cassette input of the Apple, and it was super reliable because it was no longer talking over cassette tape. It was digital audio straight through. So that actually worked. But once I got the program downloaded, all kinds of things were going wrong. So I started downloading data and looking, comparing in an emulator what the data should look like in RAM versus what I was getting. And then I figured out that only 1 bit was getting changed. And then I did a bunch of research on how the RAM worked on the Apple II, and turns out each chip is responsible for 1 bit.
That's so crazy.
Of a byte. So I found which one it was and replaced it, and all that stuff worked. That was a long story.
No, that was good. Gave me time to go over and get your set of diskettes, which are actual floppies. I mean,
oh yeah,
it's been a long time since that floppy symbol in the save programs actually involved floppies.
So so these disks. So there's a variety of stuff in it, and I had forgotten how much you had done, Matthew, because there were all these weird things you did.
Yeah. I spent too much time on that thing.
Well, what is Global Software Program Maker?
I have no idea. I think I had this notion when I was a kid that I was going to make a program that wrote programs.
Well, it's funny because you have another one here that's Global Software Presents Machine Language Disk.
Yes.
So clearly Global Software was your first
I was
company.
5. It's not even spelled correctly.
No, it's not.
Yeah, we both had software companies. It was just what we did because, you would get these professional, quote unquote, disks from companies like Muse Software, which published Silas Warner's original Castle Wolfenstein, and or Broderbund Software, and they made Alien Rain. And it all looked very professional. And I think the Alien Rain disc, Christopher, actually said on it machine language 48K. That was like they actually told you what they wrote the program in, so you'd be impressed. And then they copy protected it, so you couldn't read it anyway. And so I think we looked at that and said, "Hey, we're going to do that too." And
it all seemed so possible and easy.
Well,
except it wasn't.
Except it wasn't. Yeah, it was tractable somehow.
Well, that computer and people who use computers today probably would be flabbergasted by this, but that computer came with a full set of paper manuals. If I recall correctly, the complete schematics.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, I have the original books here, and you do. It has a complete fold-out schematic of the entire machine,
and a significant portion of the code. The operating system code.
Yep, that's right. The ROM is all disassembled.
And if you think about Apple today, and Apple, 35 years ago, and saying, well, do you know that Apple's first computer was basically open source? And people wouldn't believe you, but it was. Because there was no other way to learn either. I mean, they had a bootstrapping problem, right? It's like, how do we get people to learn to use this thing? They've never seen this before.
And so, Matthew, how did you learn to use it? Did you actually sit down and read the manual, or did you play games and then decide you wanted to go further? What?
It was weird. So, I'll back up just a little bit. Christopher, I don't know if you'll remember this, but when we got the computer, we lived in this kind of larger 1970s style track house. And it was one of these floor plans they designed back then where there was this kind of pretentious little bar for you to sit at, and in there was where my dad's stereo was, and we weren't allowed to go jumping around there or whatever. But I mean, my parents didn't use it for a bar. But one day my dad brought us both down there, and the Apple II was in there in boxes.
I remember this. I do
Very
remember
sophisticated boxes. And he says, well, this is a computer, and someday you will learn to use it, and someday maybe you will learn to program it. And, he just kind of stared at it for a minute and said, okay, whatever. And then what happened was, he set the whole thing up, and that was in the days when you had to ground yourself really carefully when you put your interface card in, and you had to do it yourself.
You still have to ground yourself. People are constantly reminding me that I still have to ground myself.
Okay, well, maybe I'm just sloppy
deeply
when I deal with electronics. We had the original one came with a 13 sector versus the then modern 16 sector DOS. We had to replace the proms for that. Anyway, he did all that, set it all up. And then I think the first thing I played was Lemonade Stand.
Yeah, God.
Oh, yes. You and I know about Lemonade Stand. Yeah, library.
So I played that and I said, God, I got to figure out how to make this work. And so then I started programming from there. And one thing that's weird from a modern standpoint, the difficulty of getting information, if you were anyone, but especially if you were of an age where you couldn't even drive. Yeah, in the very early 1980s, you had those books. And if you wanted to get another book, well, you'd have to get your mom to give you a ride up to the one store in Orange County that, carried any better computer books, and then you'd have to ask them very nicely to buy it for you, and it cost $25, which is a lot of money then, and they may or may not do that. So it's very hard to get information. So that's both a good thing and a bad thing, because, well, it's bad because you can't just learn stuff fast, but it's good because you can experiment and try to figure out how to do things by reading code that you can get, I guess the other thing is I didn't know anybody else who programmed. I mean, there was one other kid in the school who had a TRS-80 Model 1, which was, very different system, obviously. And we didn't talk a whole lot, but none of the adults had computers. Nobody knew anything about it. So, it was hard to figure things out, but that made it kind of fun. So yeah, I really don't know how we learned after that, Christopher. I mean, I don't know what you remember, but it seemed like we spent a lot of time experimenting, honestly.
There was a lot of experimenting. There were a lot of magazines besides the books. I remember getting magazines, and the magazines would sometimes have listings. That was the way you got true. A lot of software, was you had to type it in.
But that came like once a month or something.
Yeah. And it was so hard. I remember, and that's probably how I learned to type, is just typing these dumb programs in from magazines and copying
So wait,
them.
You actually learned to type correctly?
Probably mostly correctly.
Oh, because I just still do use 2 fingers, and I learned that on the Apple. It works great.
Typer-Shark is the best thing.
Yeah, well, that's modern.
Yeah, but it teaches you to type.
Yeah, typing stuff in from listings, and then in those early days, I don't really remember. I guess there were a lot of example programs that came with the DOS disks, and then there was the books. But other than that, I remember you said convincing our parents to buy us books. I remember browbeating Mom to buy me a $12 Introduction to Microcomputer Graphics, which I still have. It's upstairs. Yeah. And it was, $12 in 1980 was, I don't know what it is now, but probably 30 or $40.
Well, and it has matrix math in it and some pretty complex ideas.
It was pointlessly over my head, but there were some things in it I could do, but it was stuff like that. I want to come back to the schematic thing for a second, but before that, you mentioned Dad setting it up and then us using it. I think you kind of left out the part where he was kind of...
There's no way your dad would have left you alone to use it. Never.
Right. Oh, I was not allowed to touch disks, because you might accidentally touch the exposed region where the read head goes. Eventually, I got my own disk that I could use. And I don't know what the rules were for you, Matthew, but...
It was the same idea. What I wanted at some point was we had 2 disk drives. So it's truly a luxurious Apple. You got to give them credit. I think that whole thing was... It was the top of the line Apple II, and that was a flagship machine in that era. You talk about $12 being a lot, try $2,500.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge amount of money in the era.
That was a car.
Yeah, basically. Oh, yeah. In fact, Cal Worthington could have sold you a car for a lot less than that in that era. I saw him on TV trying to do that every day. Sure. But what I wanted to do was make the second drive work, and I needed a second disk for that. And I mean, and I got to give my dad a break because, basically and this probably, was partly what happened to you. I'm a crackpot, and whatever idea I'm having, 2/3 of the time, it's completely nuts. And see, that's one of those cases, Elecia, where I don't cuss even though I kind of want to. Anyway, so I wanted a second disc. I took a long time before he would give me a second 5 1/4-inch disc so I could at least figure out how to make the second drive work. And he was very suspicious. What do you want that for? You don't need that for. What do you want that for? You don't need that. And later on, I actually hooked up the cassette tape recorder to it also because I wanted to know how that worked. And he was furious. And,
really? I remember playing with that. It must have been afterward.
He really was against it. He didn't want me doing it. And he was like, well, that thing's going to send it a bad signal or something. It was truly hilarious. He was very conservative. But he actually did let us do whatever we wanted after a while.
Yeah.
I mean, he relaxed.
It's that first phase of this thing is really, none of us understand it. None of us understand how fragile it is.
And it's incredibly expensive.
Yeah. And it turns out, having brought it back to life, these things are not that fragile.
No.
I mean...
Apparently not.
It still works for the most part. One of the disk drives still works. Apart from one RAM chip, everything else, I'm just amazed at something that has sat for so long.
Well, this was a RAM chip that was replaced early on.
Yeah, a whole bunch of the RAM was replaced early on.
Yeah, we had a bad RAM.
And that was when you took it to one of these random shops that they had.
I think it was called the Wabash Apple.
Yeah.
Wabash.
Yeah, it was the big dealership. I mean, you went to a computer dealer the way you went to a car dealer back then.
Given the prices, that sort of makes some sense. Because you were going to say more about schematics.
Oh, well, I was just saying as I was, fixing it and rereading stuff that I used to know and looking at the board itself while taking it apart. The amazing thing about these computers is you can almost visualize how they're built just looking at them. I mean, you can't do that with anything today. Unless you've got a microscope and you could decap a chip or something. Even then, you don't know what you're looking at. But this, it's the board is big. All the chips are laid out in an array. There's very few passive components. There's silk screen around the RAM section. It says RAM. Every chip is labeled for the most part, except a few logic things. So you can actually see, okay, well, the data goes in here and it goes out here just looking at the computer. And that's an incredible educational thing. And that was through necessity. I mean, that's how things were built back then. It wasn't that they were making it that way for any particular reason. It's just how things were done. But I feel bad for people who have to learn about computers now because you don't, for the most part, actually see any of that.
Even if you have an Arduino, you may have pins labeled, but they're tiny labels and there's all this other stuff on the board that you don't know what it does.
Well, and all
the
interesting stuff is on the inside of the chip.
Yeah.
Which you don't see. And even an Arduino is probably 1,000 times faster than this computer.
Poor computer. But you can't replace just a single set of bits of RAM.
In an Arduino?
In an Arduino, because it doesn't work like that.
Oh.
Okay, so what games did you two write?
So I haven't got through all of my disks yet, so I'm not even sure. I think I tried to write some very bad adventure games, text adventure games, which... If looking at the code, I think it's very, printf this and then an if statement about go north, west, east, south, and then, okay, then printf this if you go that way, and that kind of thing. I think I did a lot of graphic stuff. I remember I found some bouncing ball programs, stuff like Arkanoid, but, more like Pong with one paddle. I never really successfully wrote anything of the complexity that Matthew did, I think.
Well, you showed me one of Matthew's program where it said push 1, 2, 3, 4 to choose things. And then the first question was like, who do you want to be? Like,
God, yeah, right.
Which one was that?
That's the adventure. That's my adventure game.
What was it called? The Dungeon of Death?
No, the Eye of Eternal Death.
The Eye of Eternal Death.
The Eye of Eternal Death. And that if anybody out there listening is going to think of writing that game, that is trademarked, man. That is mine. You have to credit me.
This was also, the confluence of Dungeons and Dragons in this computer is it can't be overlooked.
That's true. But adventure games, the thing that you might not remember is that we used to, when Mom would be shopping at Sprouse Ritz or whatever they called that 5 and dime store down there by Thrifty's, there was a Radio Shack next door. And we used to run in there and mess around with the TRS-80s they had on display that you could play with. And there were generally adventure games you could play. Text-based adventure games like that, because they were real popular on that. So I think we got the idea from doing that, and went back and tried to write them on. And they're kind of. I mean, it's a tricky thing for a kid that doesn't know that much about computers to do, because there's a lot of this. You'd have to abstract the map and do it all right, and there's actually a lot of data to handle, right? With lots of sentences and other things. And I had no idea how to do any of that. So I kind of gave up on the adventure game genre really early. And I don't know about if you did more of them or what.
I haven't found, I know I did stuff, but I haven't found a lot of things.
Well, and state machine, I mean, the games are a great way to understand state machines.
Yeah, but I'd never heard that word until probably college.
But that's an example of learning the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think programming games is a really good way. I mean, I used to teach a class like this at Cal Poly during the summer for high school kids and younger. And what I would do is we'd bring them into a room and there'd be 14 computers there, and they would program. They were Macs. They would program in True Basic, basically trying to recreate the Apple II environment minus the machine language that you needed for that. And I'd set them off in pairs writing a game, and my older kids would write asteroids with me. And the younger kids would write Lemonade Stand or an adventure game, and the ostensible purpose was to get them to learn some mathematics, because when you come down to it, that's the thing that's getting you more than anything else when you're trying to do something like that. But it's like a sugar pill around the medicine or something.
Yeah.
The kids would get so into it. And I mean, I would walk out of teaching those classes and it would like I taught an entire quarter class in a day in terms of how much energy had been taken from me, but it was all worth it. So I think it's a great thing. We were really lucky to have that when we were young, to just have the opportunity to program anything we wanted.
I got to play one of your games from then, and it said choose 1, 2, 3, 4, and like 1 was Mongo, the half elven Madge, and 2 was anyway. And then it turned out you couldn't choose 1, 2, or 3, 4. You had to type in the whole name.
I know.
And I just can't imagine the string copy and compare that really required. That would be so much harder.
There's no string copy.
No, there was no string copy. No, I didn't know any better. See, that's what I mean. I didn't really understand variables. I didn't understand any of that kind of stuff. I think that's actually one of the very first things I ever tried to program. And I didn't, and I think I listed that. I don't even think I knew to do multi-statement lines to save myself some memory. I didn't know any of that stuff. And yeah, I think if you looked at that code, you'd go, "Oh my God!" But it was a 7th grader or an 8th grader trying to teach themselves to program. So that's my excuse. But it was truly dumb, if that's what you mean.
It isn't that it was dumb or bad,
kind of cute in a dumb way, or dumb in a cute way, whatever. But
done the most difficult way possible.
Yeah, that's the best description.
But it was thought out. It was a story. It was a Dungeons and Dragon adventure, and So, why now? Why are you looking at these things this year?
Because why did I decide to do this? There was something that prompted me. I can't remember.
I mean, is it just because our house is bigger? And
no, there was some particular reason.
Matthew cleaning out his garage?
Well, I mean, the final thing that pushed me to do it was realizing how old it was and the discs weren't going to survive much longer.
It's a shock they survived this long.
Which is proving to be the case. Some of them are not in great shape. I don't know. There must have been some sort of nostalgia trigger that made me do it.
Stranger Things?
No, we got it before that then. Show. So, I was just thinking about it. I think I must have just been, or maybe I read something. I'll probably I was reading about the 6502 for some reason. I seem to remember coming across something, and
we saw that the Monster 6502. That was it. Breakout board.
That was what started me thinking about it. Yeah. So Matthew, this guy we met at Maker Faire built a 6502 out of transistors.
Oh my God!
And it's quite large. It's I'm sure. I don't know, 18 inches by 12 inches. It's a normal size full PCB panel, and he's got LEDs all around it so you can see what it's doing. And it runs at full speed. It's incredible.
That is amazing.
But I think that got me thinking, and then I eventually realized that it was probably not getting better sitting there. So
no, definitely not in our garage.
So the ultimate goal is to get as much of this data off and archived as possible, so that we can just run it in an emulator, because you can now run an Apple II in your web browser.
Oh yeah, I've already started playing Lemonade Stand.
Right. So. It runs on your phone, your Android phone, or whatever. It's just JavaScript. That's the one that's the easiest to use, but there's some more sophisticated ones. But then it just has a time capsule. Having that stuff and looking through, and it to a certain extent, it's where did I come from? Because I've been using computers constantly since then, and it's sort of defined my existence in a lot of ways.
So what did you write? And have you looked at both the game aspect and the code?
What do you mean by that?
Well, there were many questions there. Okay, what did you write?
I wrote stupid stuff. I mean, my attention span, I'm learning, was very short even then. So,
well, to be fair, there is some age gap between you and Matthew.
Yeah,
well,
a big age gap. It's true.
So Matthew, you're 7 years old?
I haven't got the other
6.
computer that
6.
I haven't got the other computer that should have more stuff from when I was preteen and teen. But I have lots of little programs where I think I was trying to figure stuff out.
And you were really actually 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Barely reading, really.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think he was
Barely reading? How dare you?
You know, that you mentioned that bouncing ball program. You typed that in by hand from reading it out of the Apple manual.
Yeah.
And
One of them, yeah.
You were a little kid. I mean, yeah, you were 5 or something. I mean, who does that at 5 years old?
But then I have one disk. I have one disk that's full of assembly language programs that I must have done around that age. Unfortunately, they aren't working. I have to figure out why.
Yeah, that's the
so you always have to write so that when you debug your code 40 years later.
But you can't with machine language. There were no comments. You just entered the opcodes and then you saved the RAM. There was nothing. So if you don't understand what you were doing, tough. Matthew was showing me one thing he'd done and he couldn't figure it out because it had this loop, this inner loop and then an outer loop. But the inner loop did something that didn't make any sense. It was decrementing a register uselessly. Well,
no, it was decrementing a register usefully, but the register hadn't been initialized. So it was like, well, how do you? And then it was doing a comparative branch afterwards. And I'm like, this is insane. You decrement the Y register and then you branch on whether it's 0, but you didn't know what it was to start with. That's insane, but it works.
We eventually kind of figured out it didn't matter. The first time it would do however many, and the next time through it would be a 255, and then it would be right.
For my life, I could not figure that out now. I mean, I was way smarter then. But whatever.
Okay, so Chris, you've looked at some of your projects, and they were small.
Yeah.
And you say they were dumb, but they were pretty good for a 5-year-old.
They were pretty darn good.
How has your software engineering and coding style changed in the intervening
Not at all. It's basically the same. Yeah. I think most people would agree that there's not been a lot of improvement.
Well, you do spell the word guesses right now.
That's because it has, auto correct.
Yes.
You don't have to spell anymore. Thank God for me.
What is the funniest thing you've found so far?
Oh, God. The funniest thing. Some of the file names are a little hilarious. Because when we're learning to type, you get frustrated with having to type a lot. So I have several dozen programs that just look like the cat walked across the keyboard, like ASDF, ASDFG. I'm not sure what was going on there. Things called even more recent program, the whole sentence with 5 exclamation points, which kind of goes against the whole hating to type thing because there's no auto-completion or partial matches on this old computer. You had to type it exactly right the whole way. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty dumb. I'm not sure what that program does. I haven't looked at it yet, but it was recent.
It was great version control there.
Well, that's the other thing is a lot of, you could see trying to do that in some of the file names. It's like this, and then that same name with some extra letter tacked on. And just seeing some of the spelling mistakes and the way we wrote sentences to command people to do things, like giving menu options. There's all sort of a weird hokiness about it.
Well, there's always the light of nostalgia there. What are you planning on doing next with it?
I need to get everything off of it. So I'm going to take one pass with it in its existing state with all the disks I have, try to get as many as I can, and then I'm going to try to repair it further, which means probably getting the disk drive working better by calibrating it. I have some other methods for getting data off it, serial and Ethernet, that I'm going to try. But then
Wait a minute, it can't have had Ethernet.
Not then.
Oh, okay.
There's always people making things now.
Retconning of hardware?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem right.
And then after that, I don't know. I think I might take the Ethernet card and put it on the internet. I had a lot of stupid ideas for projects.
That, man.
I kind of want to figure out how to make an interface. So the really cool thing about this, and I've said it once, but I'm going to say it again, is you can understand it. And because you can understand it, you can see yourself doing all kinds of things, like making a custom interface board to go to something else, like Christmas lights, or I don't know, make a SPI interface board and have it interface to something modern, just because.
Kerbal space program on that computer would be even better, especially if you do the green. Even just the interface, you could actually run it somewhere else.
I think somebody already did this. I have to find it, but I think somebody already did this.
It's pretty cool.
But there's lots of hardware projects, like just seeing, taking a scope to it and seeing how the signals work and tracing it all the way through and understanding it. Because there's no hope of doing that for a modern computer unless you're, in a lab somewhere. I almost want to encourage people, don't get an Arduino. Go on eBay, buy a computer from the early 80s.
Yeah.
Figure it out. Learn to program on it because you can do everything.
We did get a listener email this week that was somebody who asked what projects for newbies. And I think he was expecting me to say, use an Arduino to control your washing machine or something. I don't know. And my advice there is always find something that amuses you to no end and do that, because the amusement value will get you through those baffling points or the simple drudgery of having to clean the RAM chips.
Yeah, and they need cleaning. And I'm highly motivated because I want to recover this stuff before it's gone.
Well, and Matthew is there saying,
where is it? Where's the next disk? Hey, try this disk. Yeah, I really, really feel strongly about this because as I work with this, I'm remembering how I learned and the things I learned and how applicable they are to embedded systems because, there was assembly language, there was timing stuff, there was, you had control of all the signals, you had direct control of the entire computer. You could understand how the video subsystem worked and, play game. People did all sorts of hacks to it. I mean, there's some of the video game program writers did amazing things because they had nothing. It's like, okay, we have sound, except all the sound is you read one location in memory and that's mapped to click the speaker once. And they went from that to speech. How did they do that? That's incredible because they didn't know they couldn't.
And that is, yes, okay, I get that. And the understandability of it and the fact that you're understanding the smallest pieces, the atomic pieces. And now half the time, if you are using an Arduino and a motor controller, your program is only 5 lines long and your wiring is something you picked up off the internet. And sure, maybe you go beyond that, but initially it's all Lego blocks.
Yeah, and there was stuff like that for the Apple, and a lot of people, there was Logo, right?
Yeah, the turtles.
And most people didn't need to do what we did, but we were bored.
No, but you could have fun. And there was that whole discovery thing too. Like, for example, if you loaded integer basic into your language card, you got a different version of the monitor than you had with AppleSoft. And that different version of the monitor, and the monitor, if people don't know, was this built-in thing for directly accessing memory.
It's basically a disassembler.
Basically a disassembler where you could do some data entry. Well, there was a little miniature assembler in the integer basic version. So if you were willing to give up being able to deal with floating point arithmetic for a little while, then you got an assembler for free. No comments and no labels, but that's okay. And there was all this different stuff that you could find inside the monitor ROM little routines that you could run. And the same thing was true with the DOS. If you could get a book that told you what the locations were. It was so much fun to find all that stuff and modify it however you saw fit.
So this is a good point to ask you. So at some point you went from writing little games and stuff to really hacking at the system. I recall you wrote some weird things. So you wrote this thing to obscure your disks so that nobody could read them.
Yeah, that was my project in the 9th grade. And
is that the ad thing?
That's ads
DOS. Yeah. Well, I had this whole idea. Well, here's what it was. You buy like I told you buy Alien Rain and it says machine language 48K. And so the light goes on in your head, says, okay, if I want to write a game that's that good, and actually Castle Wolfenstein was really the gold standard, Christopher, with the speech synthesis and everything. And it's just one of the greatest games ever. And speaking of playing it on an emulator, I've been playing it for the last couple of days and I like it just as much as I did in 1981. It's a little too addicting. Anyway, long story short was, to do that kind of thing, you had to be good at machine language, both for speed and for getting access to all this stuff. So I had built this whole system. I'd actually written an assembler for myself, very badly.
But most people can't say they've even written a very, very bad assembler. So
yeah, this one was he would take the cake for bad, but I had one. And so this whole system I had built around it. And then the other thing was these games always came with copy protection. So I just started to think about how you would do that. And I learned how to make the reset key automatically reboot your disk, because that was the thing you could do. On an Apple, you could hit reset and it would supposedly put you into BASIC right away. But to keep people from pushing reset to, list or disassemble their game, they would remap the reset key to just reboot the disk. So I figured out how to do that. And then I started reading about DOS and I had another book that had a lot of detailed information about it, and I recoded some stuff so that you couldn't just read the catalog or get information off of it easily. You'd have to actually know a lot. And I don't know what got me into that, but and I made it so that the Hello program could be a binary program instead of an AppleSoft program. I don't know what got me into that, but it was kind of hacking, I guess.
Well, there was this whole culture, I remember, at school of people passing around disks and cracking them. So there were, and making disk destroyers.
Which school?
The disk destroyer I made. That's right. Yeah.
The school we both went to.
Yeah.
So like elementary
and middle high school. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were, by a certain point, a lot of people had Apples, and that school had purchased a whole raft of quote unquote Apples. They were actually Franklin's, yeah, which were clones of Apples that Apple somehow let them do.
No, they sued them and shut them down about a year after the school got those computers. I think. Yeah,
and then people were passing around games and figuring out how to crack them. And I don't know where they were getting this stuff. Maybe they had modems back then and we didn't, or something. But yeah, there was this whole culture of breaking copy protection and making your own copy protection and making things that would destroy people's disks for some reason.
Yeah,
and because you could directly access the way the disk drives work on the Apple II. Is Wozniak's genius was to take a lot of the cost out of the disk drives by pushing it to software. So disk drives back then had complicated controller hardware. They, had lots of stuff for indexing and figuring out where they were. And they needed to make a disk drive, a floppy disk drive that would cost them $100 in parts, which was unheard of, and everybody thought they were crazy. And he went away for a few months, and he figured out, okay, I'm going to do all this stuff in software and have minimal electronics to drive the actual disk head and do all of that operation. So the upshot of that is you could do a lot of things to alter how disks were written and read by altering the software that the computer came with. And of course, you had it all available to you to do that.
Yeah.
So people would make disks that you just couldn't access because the sectors were off a little bit, or because they changed how the disk was laid out and DOS wouldn't work because it was running something they'd written. So you could do these incredible things, and that hacker ethic still exists, but it's much more sophisticated now and doing other stuff. But you're frowning at me.
I'm not. It's cloudy in Lemonville.
Oh, you're playing Lemonade Stand. Don't worry, it'll be sunny soon.
I thought you were paying attention to me.
No. See, those games, they're addictive.
Did you really ask your parents to bring you another computer when they drive across the country next
I
month?
did, yes.
Good.
So I had the successor. I browbeat them to buy me a new computer in the late 80s, I think it was.
Yeah, it was after I went to college.
And this was... So Apple had a bit of an identity crisis in the 80s. Jobs hated the Apple II after a certain point and went off to make the Mac. And Wozniak was still, I think, involved in pushing the Apple II side of things. And so there was this battle between both sides of the company about which way it was going to go. So for a while, both kinds of computers were available. And there was one final Apple II made called the Apple II GS, which was kind of like ridiculous Apple II because it had sound synthesizer chips. It had, megabytes of memory if you wanted. It had a 16-bit processor instead of 8-bit. It was much faster, but it could run all the same stuff the old Apple II could. So the main reason I want that is to get whatever software I wrote for that, and to have a backup machine that I can potentially pull old disk stuff off if this one doesn't work for some reason. So yeah, another project.
And Matthew, you had another computer as well, a Timex Sinclair
1000. Yeah. So Clive, I don't know how you say his name, Sinclair.
Clive, I think.
Clive, yeah, okay. He is a British fella, and he tried to make computers that were truly affordable for people. And, so we were talking about how expensive Apples were. So he made a machine called a ZX80, which was followed up by another machine called the ZX81. And what they were Z80-based machines with just 4 chips on them. And the British version came with just 1K of RAM. And they had a membrane keyboard, and they cost $100, which was still a lot of money then, but was a lot cheaper than anything else you could get. And so they were I guess they were manufactured in Scotland, but when they were introduced to the United States, either it might have been a second iteration. They were the Timex Sinclair 1000 instead of the ZX81.
Okay. Yeah.
And they came with 2K of RAM built in instead of 1K. So my summer of my 8th grade year, what I really wanted was a Z80. I wanted to program a Z80.
Why?
Because it was this cool processor. I mean, it acted like a 16-bit processor, even though it was an 8-bit processor. They were 4 megahertz instead of 1.023 or whatever the 6502 was.
It wasn't because most arcade games in arcades were running Z80s.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
No, I had, and I'll tell you what, I don't know how you would have found that out then. I mean,
That's probably true.
I mean, I had no idea what kind of hardware they had in video game arcades, but it all ran really fast and really smooth. Everybody knew that. Anyway, I just wanted the Z80 so I could learn to do that. And I also just liked the idea of buying my own machine, right? Dad, of course, was extremely against it. And so the way this ended up working is my parents were building a house, and I got the summer job to go sweep up all the construction mess, earning a couple of dollars an hour to do it. So I swept up dirt all summer. And when I was about $85, so it's just a few dollars away from being able to buy it, we went over to the house one day, and the painter had his old German Shepherd, had brought his old German Shepherd onto the property. It turned out later this dog had bitten 2 people before. And so Mom had said, well, you're not going to be allowed to go in there and sweep until the painter's done because I don't want you breathing the paint fumes. I said, okay. So we went over there, and I'm walking through the hallways to see if the paint's dry, and this German Shepherd runs up and bites me. Bit me on the back of the leg and the front of the leg. And anyway, long story short was about 3 days later, Mom finally said, well, Dad decided it's probably okay if you go ahead and get that computer, even though you haven't earned all the money. So, my dog bite settlement was $15 or whatever. So I ordered that, and, Dad would see me programming it because, of course, it used a cassette tape, and he would say inferior as he walked by. But it wasn't all bad, though. So eventually, a company called Memotech made RAM packs for this because it had a single exposed, interface jack on the back. And so I got a 32K RAM pack for it. And that was cool. But the problem was the way this machine was made to keep costs down, where your 9-volt power supply went in, it went to a voltage regulator chip. And the way they cooled that, they just stuck a heatsink on it. Okay. And it was in this tiny little plastic container. So what would happen is I'd put my memo pack on there for my 32K RAM. It would run for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then the screen would start filling up full of stuff. And I thought it was a bad RAM. I kept calling the company trying to figure out what it was. They said it was my power supply. I got a 2-amp power supply. It happened even faster. Finally, what we figured out was happening, and I don't even know how I think I got this from a magazine. It was overheating because of that heat sink.
Yeah.
So Dad actually helped me do this. We took it apart, unsoldered the voltage regulator, connected up some 22 gauge wire. And we put the voltage regulator and its heat sink in a shoebox and ran the 22 wire back into it, and it never overheated again. It worked great. So Sinclair had never figured on having 32K attached to it.
Well, I can't remember if that was SRAM or DRAM on that thing. It must have been DRAM.
God, I don't know.
Well, one of the problems I'm having with the Apple is, you mentioned 9 volts going in and all this voltage regulator stuff is, I wanted to do a little bit of fooling around with the RAM chips since I had some spare now, and make like a little RAM chip tester with a little microcontroller and just learn how to, bang the signals on the chip to drive it. The problem is all these old chips have ridiculous power requirements. Like each RAM chip needs +5, -5, and 12.
Wow.
And which, is actually hard to come by in the modern era.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I thought maybe a PC power supply would do it, but it turns out it didn't have a negative.
My desk supply will do it.
Your desk supply is a boat anchor.
Well, yeah.
Anyway, the thing about the Timex machine that was cool, there was actually some pretty interesting software you could get for it. I had an assembler for it. So I could do a little bit of Z80 assembly language. That was cool. But the really neat thing is I had ZX4th, Now, I don't know if do you know what Forth is? You guys will know.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knows.
We know
It's a
what Forth
stack-based
is.
language, which for a ninth grader is insane. The syntax of that language, I still don't think I understand it. But I learned to write some little Forth programs. I mean, we couldn't get that on an Apple easily. I mean, it's pretty inside baseball stuff, but you could get it for that little machine. It was a cool machine. It was fun.
Yeah, I remember that machine because I always wanted to play it because it was something different. And you had it. And it had some different games.
Yeah.
It had a flight simulator.
I knew you would remember that. I knew.
Stupid. I mean,
no, it was fun to land. Come on.
But there was basically no graphics. It was.
Hey, you could see the lights on the runway.
It was a runway and a line for the horizon if you were lucky. And that was it. And I remember fighting with that thing because, as you said, it had the cassette port. And the hit rate for getting the program off the cassette was probably about 35%. So I would spend hours trying to get the flight simulator to load, and it just wouldn't work a lot of the time. But yeah, God,
it was very sensitive to volume. It was you had to really, really dial in the volume on the tape recorder carefully.
This whole show sounds like we had to walk uphill both ways, doesn't it?
Well, no, because it was really fun. I mean,
it's true. There was nothing to compare it to.
No.
Well, as somebody whose main form of computer interaction came from free hours in the library, you guys don't really sound like you were under a lot of hardship.
Oh, no, it was
That's not what I was trying to say. Compared to somebody who's grown up on an iPad.
Oh my goodness, that would be so different.
Yeah.
It's not even in the same league. I mean, I set my phone down on the Apple II Plus when I'm working on it sometimes, and I just stare at these two things next to each other, and my brain just kind of shuts down because it doesn't make any sense.
They aren't even that far apart in years.
They aren't that far apart in how they
terrifying.
Work. They still work the same way. It's scaled up and with additional complexity. But the fundamentals of how DRAM works, that's the same. The fundamentals of how a CPU works, that's the same. That's the thing that's baffling, is all of this persisted. Even though, it's ridiculously simple, and the computer we have upstairs is probably 1 billion times faster, and I'm not kidding.
That's the graphics computer that runs the VR system.
Yeah. It's, apart from the GPU, which is a novel architecture to a certain extent, the rest of it's all kind of evolved over the years in a very step-by-step way.
So iPads are a good thing to talk about because it is an easy way to interact with computers. But it's not the same sort of interaction.
No.
This being able to take it apart and to program. And you could program Swift on an iPad. There's no reason why you can't program on an iPad.
Right.
But I don't know that it is causing the same level of both nostalgia inducing that I don't think anybody is going to care about iPads in 35 years.
Not the same way, probably.
Not the affection you feel for this computer you have strewn about the room.
It was my friend.
Yeah.
Exactly. So how do we help people have that interaction so that they go into hardware and software?
Yeah. So first thing we do is have a violent dystopic revolution that undoes the last 35 years of technological development. And I think we'll be there. I think it'll be fine.
That's all we need.
No, apart from my suggestion of going and buying one of these things, which you can do. It's weird. The market for these is crazy. Some of them go for a few $100s and some of them are thousands. Probably depends on how pristine they are. But you can pick up an old Apple II for probably $100-$200, or a Commodore 64, same chip, or any of these other things.
TRS-80s.
But if you don't want to do that, I think you can buy I don't know. I want to say you can do the Arduino and microcontroller route because that really is the closest.
Well, Raspberry Pi and BeagleBone allow you to play with more things. They allow you to make more games and to play more games on them.
They're just Linux computers with additional signals out. I don't really feel like they're even spiritually close at all.
The way that they're close is that your dad buys one and says, "Don't touch it. That's dangerous. Don't touch it. You'll break it."
Nobody's going to say that about a $5 Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. The Raspberry Pi is $5. They're disposable.
I think they're a little more than that. But yeah,
Zero?
There are some. Oh, right. The Zero came out. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, let me answer it a kind of roundabout way by saying some of the other projects that I'm thinking about doing.
I promise I will not let him list everything this time.
No, it may just be one. It may just be one. One of them is to build a minimal 6502 based computer, and from scratch. And it turns out I found some other people who've done similar things. It's not that hard. You can do it in 8 chips.
Well, and the 6502 is special because it is a thoroughly understandable processor.
Yes.
There's the MSP 430 from TI is a nice line. It's pretty simple. It's not too complex, but you can't have the whole processor in your head at one time.
How many registers does the MSP 430 have?
Exactly. It has a lot. Chris Scott has been writing posts on how to get that working, and he ended up having to take 3 weeks to turn on an LED due to a button press because you have to start explaining, well, what's a pull-up resistor? And what's a GPIO port, and how do you change the direction and the style? And it gets really complicated.
I don't think this is going to make it any easier, though, because this 6502 is an actual microprocessor. It's not a microcontroller. So it needs all the support hardware. It needs clocking. It needs all the weird voltages.
But it's outside, so you can see all that.
Yeah.
Well, you only got like 5 actual registers in there, 8-bit. The only 16-bit register is the program counter, and you won't care about that anyway.
Well, and there's only one real register.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, the accumulator. The other registers are indexes.
Yeah, right. X and Y.
And there's,
your flags register, and that's it.
I think I've explained the entire processor in the last sentence. Pretty much. And it has a very simple instruction set.
Very simple.
But I don't know what to suggest to get the similar feel, and maybe it's just not possible. But get an emulator and fool around. Get an emulator and play with these old computers.
The thing that's going to be hard with this, though, there was a certain thing of the particular era. It's not just the machine or its simplicity or its construction brilliance or any of that. It was just the era when it was too, because it was so incredibly new for us. Nobody had anything like this, and all of a sudden it was here. And so there was this whole sense of wonder to it that when everybody's walking around with a huge computer in their phone now, it just isn't. I don't know how you'd recap. The spiritual part of it would be really hard to redo, I think.
The closest thing I can think of right now is VR. And it's a very small community, and the people who are excited about it are super excited about it.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
People are making really small programs that other people are really enjoying that are very simple, but it's just because the experience is so new and novel that's okay. You have this little blocky thing where you throw things around, or you play, Pong. One of my favorite games I just got is ping pong. And you're in like a loft apartment that's beautifully rendered, and you play ping pong. And it's like, I remember Pong from the 70s and had a similar feeling, but now it's perfectly rendered in 3D, and it's a virtual environment. There's this very strange juxtaposition of, we're at that again, but 9 billion times more sophisticated. Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of nostalgia associated with it, so it's hard to separate that out. But I do think it's a different kind of education doing it this way, having done it that way, than what you can do today without really thinking about it and planning how you're going to learn.
You had a lot more experiential learning with this. When we first met, you were always way more willing to touch the hardware than I was. And most of my learning came from books and theory and reading about things. So this was a different path. I think they're both good paths. It's just you can have different paths to getting into engineering. Although that does bring me back to one more question from Matthew. Why aren't you a software engineer?
That's actually a really good question.
Let me tell you.
No, here's how I'm going to answer that. So, I told you I had to play this wedding a week ago. And the thing about it was about a 5-minute gig for me. Now, it was a terrifying gig because it was, I'm playing a girl down the aisle and their parents have spent tens of thousands of dollars, whatever. But
and you know the young woman very well.
I know the young woman very well, but don't know any of the other people there, and it's this big deal. So I had that gig, but I didn't have any other gigs until last night, for the last 2 weeks. And all last week, I was telling my wife, God, I don't feel well. I don't know what's wrong with me. I think maybe I should go to the doctor. My energy level's down. I just feel bad. I don't know what's wrong. And And I really just didn't physically feel well for like a week, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And about 3 minutes into the gig last night, I went, oh, I know what's wrong. And basically, I feel great today. I feel awesome. And it's just because I was on stage for 2 hours. And so, I mean, I think the thing is, whatever you do, it just has to be whoever you are, and the thing that makes you high or makes you feel like yourself. And for me, that ends up being guitar, without it being a value judgment on anything else that anybody does. That's just what it is for me. And I don't really feel like I get a lot of choice about it. For other people, it's something else. So I think, I tried a bunch of different careers on the way towards this, obviously.
You were a software engineer for a while.
I was a software engineer, and it didn't really suit me, And I think the thing is that the kind of wonder that was there with the Apple II when I was young was never there when I was working for a company. It just wasn't. It was a job where I sat and worked for 8 hours a day. And now part of that's the era too, because I had to wear a tie and go in and be there at certain hours.
You were an East Coast software engineer.
Yeah,
too.
It was not like,
Sorry,
it's not
East
like
Coast
working
listeners.
for Apple or doing the kind of stuff you two guys do. I mean, totally different.
Oh yeah, ours is totally fun all the time. We cannot contain our excitement about the stuff we do every day. It's literally, we have to be told to stop working because we'll just never stop.
Yeah, but you're not wearing a tie.
Oh, I wear all kinds of things.
Okay, well, that's up to you, but you don't have to wear a tie. And, I can just remember getting home from work from doing that and just feeling spent, Yeah. Anyway, so it just didn't work for me in that environment. And maybe I just didn't do the kind of projects that would have made me happy. I don't know. I should have probably been a game programmer if I was going to do that. But
well, you were working on like simulations of power plants or something?
Yeah, I did simulations for cogeneration plants. Real exciting stuff. And then I did an instrumentation program for a company that was making DAT drives back in the very early 90s to try to figure out how to make them proper control software.
Digital audio tape. It was like storage backup tapes.
Yeah, it was right. So it was basically a glorified VCR on a miniature scale that, would actually could store a whole gigabyte on a tape or something, which was a big deal back then as a backup for your hard drive for businesses. So I had very kind of dry stuff, nothing really.
Well, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't mention your actual first software engineering job.
Which was that?
Where you wrote the grade database for the school.
Yeah.
For $5 or something.
No, I got $100. And just to explain that era to you, do you know what I did with that $100?
You spent it on, I'm not going to say because that's probably not safe for family.
Oh, no, I bought a TRS-80 color computer too, 16K. They were on sale that year for $99. And I
How does profit back in? That's like I'm doing in lemonade stand.
But what I wanted to hear is how the school managed to convince somebody to write their entire system for $100.
Okay, well here no, they didn't offer to pay me. What happened was,
oh my God.
No. So my math teacher that year was a guy named Mr. Bell, and his job was to run to
my
so what they
cross-country
used to do when they did report cards, every teacher had to fill out one of these in triplicate things, okay, by hand for each student with, the name, the grade, the semester average, the effort grade, and the comments. And so they at some point asked one of the teacher's husbands who taught at UCI to write them a program to do this on the Apple because they had all these Franklins. So he wrote one in a weekend. Now, this is a little bit inside baseball too, I guess, but what he actually did, he didn't put a lot of time or thought into it, I guess. He used what was called a random access text file to store all the student data. And the upshot of that was to access a given student for their grade information required the disk drive to actually physically access the disk. And so the problem with this was when there's hundreds of students and it had to keep accessing over and over again, Mr. Bell could not get the program to print out the school's report cards without the disk physically failing. So what he was doing was copying the disk and running it simultaneously on all 16 of the school's computers, hoping that just one disk would work. And he ended up staying up all night. And so he was complaining to me, and I said, well, I can do this. I'll write you a new program that'll do it right. And I had no idea what I had bitten off. And so I said, well, the secret to this is just to load all the students' data into memory at once. And it never occurred to me to sit down with a calculator and say, how does that work with 48K of RAM? Anyway, that is what I ended up ultimately doing. But I mean, it was a huge project for me to figure out how to get it to run. But it did run, and they used it for 5 or 6 years.
I think maybe longer.
Maybe longer. And then eventually I wasn't there anymore because I was off in college. But it took me months to do that. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping you're going to recover the rest of.
Yes.
Just so I can see it was a huge project though. Yeah, that was my first job. Yeah, I got $100 for it. The teachers took up a collection amongst themselves and gave me a little card, which I have somewhere. And I was, yeah. Well, I remember when I finished it, we were going on a ski trip up to Mammoth. I don't know if you'll remember this, but, it had finally run correctly, and done like all the semester GPA honor roll computations and all that correctly, like 2 days before we left on this trip, or maybe one day. I think I actually had to go in and help the day before we left. And I think I slept from Southern California all the way to Lone Pine in the back of the car before I was just so tired because I just never slept. Because they used to pull me out of class to have me come try to fix whatever thing I'd broken. Yeah, I was just, I had no idea what I was doing at all.
How old were you with this?
16.
Oh, the things. Yes.
So, kids, if you want to see what it was like, go watch War Games.
Oh, yeah. Would you like to play a game of chess?
All right. I think it is time to get back to our weekend and for Christopher to get back to taking discs off of this.
Yeah, come on, man. I'm waiting for the rest of those.
Chris, do you have any more questions?
Questions?
Comments? Taunts to your brother?
I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Well, how many hours do you have?
I think you guys should go back to phone for a while and then maybe we'll talk again when you've got some more things off.
Grab some beer and we can sit around and talk all day.
Matthew, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, just do what you want. That's my last thought.
All right. That's a good one, actually. That's a really good one. Our guest has been Matthew White, guitar player who teaches math during the day. He's a professor of mathematics at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, the frontman of the Ballistic Cats, and guitar player for Rumble. Thank you to Matthew for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And for letting Christopher out of yard jail long enough to write some software.
Come on.
Thank you to Christopher for producing and co-hosting. And of course, thank you for listening. Hit the contact link or email us, show@embedded.fm if you'd like to say hello. Now, as usual, I have a final thought to leave you with. Actually, I have 3 here that I have to choose between, and they're all really good. Let's go with Mark Twain from Pudd'nhead Wilson. So this is a real Mark Twain quote. Adam was but human. This explains it all. He did not want the apple for the apple's sake. He wanted it only because it was forbidden. The mistake was in not forbidding the serpent. Then he would have eaten the serpent. Embedded FM is an independently produced radio show that focuses on the many aspects of engineering. It is a production of Logical Elegance, an embedded software consulting company in California. If there are advertisements in the show, we did not put them there and do not receive any revenue from them. At this time, our sole sponsor remains Logical Elegance.